Kenneth's burned palms were still smoking when they found him with the unconscious princess, whose skin was covered in ash from hell. They were ready to kill him, but then the little girl opened her eyes and whispered one word that made three hardened soldiers fall to their knees in shame. The forest held its breath in the gathering dusk, every shadow deepening into pools of potential death. Kenneth moved through the undergrowth with the practiced silence of a predator who had learned that survival depended on becoming invisible, becoming part of the wilderness itself. At 40 years old, his body bore the map of 7 brutal years lived alone on this unforgiving world. Every scar told a story of near death. Every callus marked a lesson learned through pain and blood. His face was weathered leather, carved by wind and sun into harsh planes and deep lines. His eyes, though, remained sharp as obsidian chips, missing nothing in the dimming light. Those eyes tracked the blue-furred predator that had eluded him for 3 long days, a creature that moved through these woods like liquid shadow, intelligent and deadly. The beast had killed twice in the territory Kenneth considered his own, leaving behind the torn remains of grazing animals that represented potential food stolen from his stores. Kenneth crouched beside a tree trunk, thick as his torso, studying the fresh claw marks scored deep into the bark. The wood was still weeping sap, which meant the creature had passed within the last hour. He pressed his fingers into the grooves, feeling the depth and angle, reading the story written there. The predator was large, perhaps 300 pounds of muscle and fang, moving eastward toward the rocky outcrops where the forest gave way to broken stone and narrow ravines. The bow in his hands was a weapon he had crafted during his second winter here, when cold and hunger had nearly claimed him. Carved from ironwood that grew twisted and nearly unbreakable in the highland valleys, strung with sinew harvested from a 6-legged grazer he had tracked for 2 weeks before making the kill. Each arrow in his leather quiver bore his personal mark, fletched with the iridescent blue-green feathers of cliff birds that nested in the canyon walls. He had climbed to those nests in spring, risking a fall that would have shattered every bone, because he needed those feathers, and there was no one else to get them for him. His clothing was layered hide and fur, each piece taken from animals he had hunted and prepared himself. The outer layer was thick grazer leather, tough enough to turn thorns and light claws. Beneath that, softer rabbit-like pelts for warmth. His boots were wrapped in cloth strips to muffle his footfalls, replaced weekly because the rough terrain destroyed them quickly. At his belt hung his knife, a blade he had forged himself from salvaged metal, and a hand axe with a head shaped from a piece of the crashed colony ship that had brought him to this world. Kenneth had lived alone for 7 years, 2 months and 16 days, though he had stopped counting weeks ago. Time was measured differently now, in seasons and migrations, in the ripening of berries and the freezing of streams. His shelter was a dugout carved into a cliff face, hidden behind a screen of thorny vines he had carefully cultivated to grow across the entrance. Inside, his possessions were arranged with the precision of a soldier who had never forgotten his training. Dried meat hung from wooden hooks. His weapons were oiled and wrapped against moisture. Water bladders made from animal stomachs were kept filled and sealed. He did not miss civilization, or so he told himself during the long nights when sleep would not come, and memories pressed against his mind like physical weights. The colony ship had carried 217 souls, families seeking a new start on a world the survey teams had promised would be paradise. The atmospheric entry had gone catastrophically wrong, systems failing in cascading waves of fire and screaming metal. Kenneth had been in the cargo hold, strapping down supplies when the first explosions tore through the ship. He remembered being thrown against a bulkhead, the taste of blood in his mouth, the desperate scramble through smoke and flame to reach an escape pod. Only one pod had made it to the surface intact. His pod. When he had finally managed to open the warped hatch and crawl out onto the alien soil, he had been alone. The main ship had impacted in the mountains to the north, a fireball visible even from 50 miles away. Kenneth had walked toward that pyre for 3 days, hope dying a little more with each step. When he finally reached the wreckage, he had found twisted metal and burned bodies, 43 colonists he had known by name. He had spent 2 weeks digging graves in the rocky soil, 2 weeks with hands that bled and blistered and finally calloused, building cairns over people who had dreamed of new lives and found only death. After burying the last body, a child of 8 whose name had been Sarah, and who had liked to draw pictures of flowers, Kenneth had walked away from the crash site and never looked back. He headed south, following a river valley, putting distance between himself and the ghosts. For the first year, he had fully expected to die. Starvation, predators, disease, accident. This world offered 1,000 ways to kill the unwary. But somehow he had learned, adapted, survived. He had studied the plants, testing them on himself in tiny amounts, noting which caused illness and which provided nutrition. He had observed the animals, learning their behaviors, their territories, their weaknesses. He had made weapons from stone and bone, then later from salvaged metal when he found pieces of the colony ships scattered across the landscape. He had built shelter, made fire, hunted and been hunted in turn. And slowly, day by day, he had transformed from a desperate refugee into something harder, something shaped by necessity into a perfect instrument of survival. The blue-furred predator broke cover just as the last sliver of sun touched the western horizon. That moment when day creatures sought shelter and night hunters emerged. It was even larger than Kenneth had estimated, easily matching a terrestrial tiger in size, with a sleek body built for both power and speed. Its fur rippled in shades of electric blue and deeper indigo, providing natural camouflage among the bluish vegetation of this world. The head was broad and flat, the maw filled with curved fangs designed for tearing through hide and crushing bone. Its eyes glowed with bioluminescent amber in the gathering darkness, a trait that helped night vision, but also betrayed its position to a careful observer. The creature had not detected Kenneth. He remained absolutely still, barely breathing, his body positioned so that the light wind carried his scent away. The predator was focused on something ahead, stalking through the undergrowth with liquid grace. Kenneth watched it for several heartbeats, studying its movement pattern, waiting for the perfect moment. The beast paused at a small clearing, head raised, testing the air. Its shoulder was exposed, the vital organs beneath protected only by fur and muscle. Kenneth's jaw was smooth as water flowing, his fingers finding the string and pulling back in one continuous motion. His breathing was controlled, his heart rate steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The bow creaked softly as it reached full draw, the arrow point gleaming dully in the fading light. He did not aim in the conventional sense, did not line up sights or calculate angles. After 7 years of constant practice, the bow was an extension of his body, the arrow an extension of his will. He released. The arrow flew true and silent, crossing 40 feet in less than a second. It took the predator through the throat, just behind the jaw, punching through windpipe and major vessels before lodging against the spine. The beast's roar of surprise and pain was cut short as its airway flooded with blood. It thrashed sideways, powerful legs scrabbling for purchase, then crashed into the undergrowth with enough force to snap branches. The thrashing continued for several seconds, the creature's nervous system firing in violent death spasms, then gradually weakened and finally stilled. Kenneth waited a full minute before moving, his second arrow nocked and ready. Wounded animals could be more dangerous than healthy ones, capable of a final desperate attack that could kill even as they died. But there was no movement from the heap of blue fur, no sound except the settling of disturbed vegetation. Kenneth approached cautiously, his steps careful and deliberate, his eyes scanning for any sign of threat from other predators drawn by the smell of blood. When he reached the corpse, he knelt beside it, his free hand pressing against the still warm flank. He felt the moment life fully departed, that subtle change in tension that marked the transition from living creature to meat. Kenneth closed his eyes for a breath, acknowledging the kill with the respect he gave every animal he took. This creature had fought for survival just as he did, had hunted and struggled and lived with the same desperate intensity. Its death had meaning because it would allow him to continue living, would provide food and materials he needed to survive another week, another month. Then he drew his knife and began the work of field dressing, his movements efficient and practiced. He made the initial incision carefully, avoiding the organs that could spoil the meat if punctured. The hide would be valuable, thick and durable enough to make clothing or shelter material. The sinews would be dried and used for cordage. The bones could be shaped into tools. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant death on a world where every resource was precious and hard-won. By the time Kenneth had the choicest cuts wrapped in leather and tied to a carrying frame made of branches, full night had fallen across the forest. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset here, the thin atmosphere unable to retain heat. Kenneth hefted the frame onto his shoulders, feeling the satisfying weight of fresh meat, and began the long trek back to his shelter. The path was treacherous in darkness, but he knew every root and stone, every dip and rise. He had walked this route hundreds of times in all weather and all seasons. The storm he had sensed building throughout the day was almost upon him. The air had that electric quality that preceded the violent weather systems that swept across this region without warning. Kenneth quickened his pace, not running, but moving with purposeful speed. He needed to reach shelter before the deluge hit, needed to secure his supplies and bank his fire. The storms here were not like Earth storms, gentle rain and distant thunder. They were catastrophic events, lightning that struck like artillery, winds that could strip flesh from bone, rain that fell with enough force to bruise. Kenneth was checking his water catchment barrels, making sure they were positioned to collect the rainfall, when the sky tore open with light. It was not lightning, though the initial flash was bright enough to sear after images into his vision. The light was sustained, a brilliant white blue that transformed night into noon, casting stark shadows that seemed to vibrate with intensity. Kenneth's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing against the glare, and he saw something that made his breath catch in his chest. A streak of fire carved across the cloud layer, a burning contrail that lit up the entire sky. Something massive was falling from orbit, trailing flames and smoke and pieces of itself, its trajectory steep and uncontrolled. The object was clearly artificial, too regular in shape to be a meteor, too large to be anything but a spacecraft. Kenneth watched it descend with terrible speed, watched it disappear beyond the western ridge, perhaps 2 miles distant, watched the moment of impact that turned the horizon into a wall of fire. The sound arrived seconds later, a rolling boom that shook the ground beneath his feet and rattled his bones. Birds exploded from the trees in panicked flocks. In the distance, animals screamed in terror. The shockwave hit Kenneth like a physical blow, forcing him to brace against the cliff face. A pillar of fire rose from the impact site, climbing into the storm clouds, illuminating the churning sky from below. Kenneth stood in the gathering rain, his hair already plastered to his skull, staring at that distant inferno. Every instinct honed by 7 years of survival screamed at him to stay where he was, to secure his shelter, to wait out both storm and fire in safety. Whatever had crashed was not his problem, not his responsibility. He owed nothing to whatever or whoever might be in that burning wreck. Survival meant making hard choices, meant prioritizing self-preservation above all else. But Kenneth remembered being trapped in wreckage himself, remembered the desperate minutes before he had managed to open the escape pod hatch, remembered the certainty that he was going to die alone and forgotten. He remembered screaming for help that never came, remembered the silence that had answered his cries, and he remembered the faces of the 43 colonists he had buried. People who might have survived if a rescue had come faster, if someone had been there to pull them from the flames. He stepped back into his dugout and gathered his emergency gear with quick, economical movements. His battle knife, 14 inches of carefully maintained steel with an edge he could shave with. His hand axe, balanced for both utility and combat. A coil of rope made from braided plant fiber, strong enough to hold his weight. His bow and a full quiver of arrows, because he did not know what he might face out there. He wrapped everything in oiled leather to protect against the rain, secured the bundle across his back, and stepped out into the storm. The journey was a nightmare march through wind and water and darkness. The rain had transformed from scattered drops into a solid wall of water that hammered down with punishing force. Lightning cracked overhead constantly, close enough that Kenneth could smell ozone burning in the air, close enough that each flash left purple after images dancing across his vision. The forest floor had become a treacherous maze of hidden roots and sudden sinkholes, mud that tried to suck his boots off with every step. Kenneth moved as quickly as he dared, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to avoid the worst hazards. He crossed a stream that had been ankle-deep that morning, but was now a raging torrent, balancing along a fallen log with arms extended for stability, feeling the water clawing at his legs and trying to sweep him away. He climbed over deadfalls slick with rain and rot, ducked beneath branches that whipped in the wind like living things trying to flay him. Twice he heard the territorial roars of nocturnal predators, massive things that hunted in darkness and storm. But he skirted around their territories, unwilling to risk confrontation. The glow from the crash site grew stronger as he approached, a hellish orange-red that pulsed with each gust of wind feeding the flames. The chemical stench of burning reached him long before he crested the final ridge. A smell unlike anything produced by burning wood, acrid and bitter and wrong. Kenneth's eyes were watering from the smoke and rain by the time he reached the top of the ridge and looked down into the crater. The spacecraft was unlike anything Kenneth had ever seen, and he had seen the colony ships that humanity used for interstellar travel. This was alien technology, genuinely alien, the kind of thing that should not exist according to everything he had been taught. The hull was smooth and organic looking, flowing curves with no visible seams or rivets, made from some kind of alloy that shifted colors even as it burned. Blue and silver and gold rippled across the surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The impact had torn the ship open, exposing interior spaces that glowed with strange light, revealing technology that Kenneth could not begin to comprehend. Pieces of the ship had been flung across the crater in a debris field that stretched for hundreds of yards. Some pieces were still glowing with residual heat, bright enough to read by even in the darkness. Others had already cooled to black twisted metal. Flames licked across the main hull section, fed by whatever exotic fuel the craft used, burning in colors that should not exist in nature. Green flames, purple flames, flames that burned bright blue and cast no heat. The rain seemed to have no effect on them, the water evaporating before it could extinguish anything. Kenneth started down the slope, his boots sliding in loose dirt turned to slurry by rain. The heat from the burning ship pressed against his face even from 50 yards away, an intensity that made his skin prickle and his eyes water worse than before. He pulled his leather jerkin up over his nose and mouth, creating a makeshift filter against the worst of the smoke, and squinted against the stinging air. The crater floor was littered with debris, both large and small, some of it recognizable as ship components, most of it completely alien in purpose and design. He stepped over a section of what might have been a control panel, all melted crystal and dead lights. He skirted around a twisted piece of bulkhead that was still hot enough to glow dull red. The smoke was thick here, choking, reducing visibility to mere feet. Kenneth moved by feel as much as sight, his hands extended, testing each step before committing his weight. He could hear things settling inside the ship, groans of tortured metal, hisses of escaping gases, the crackle and pop of fire consuming exotic materials. And then, beneath all that noise, he heard something else, a sound so faint he almost missed it, so human and vulnerable that it froze him in place. A child was crying. The sound was thin and weak, nearly lost beneath the ambient chaos, but unmistakable once Kenneth's ears locked onto it. A whimper, a soft sob, the kind of sound that transcended species and language, the universal cry of a young thing in pain and fear. Kenneth's head whipped around, trying to locate the source. There, to his left, partially buried under a collapsed section of hull plating, something small was moving. Kenneth ran. The heat became unbearable within 10 steps, hot enough that he felt his exposed skin beginning to blister, hot enough that his clothes started to smoke. His lungs burned with every breath, the superheated air scorching tissue. His eyes blurred with tears that evaporated as soon as they formed, but he did not slow, could not slow, because that crying was getting weaker and he knew what that meant. He reached the collapsed section and dropped to his knees, his hands already working to clear smaller pieces of debris. She was so impossibly small, a child who could not have been more than 6 years old, her tiny body pinned beneath a metal beam as thick as Kenneth's thigh. Her skin was blue, not painted or dyed, but naturally, genuinely blue, the color of deep water on a clear day. Her hair was darker, almost purple-black, matted now with ash and what looked like blood. Her eyes were large and luminous, more alien than her skin, but the terror in them was purely universal. She was crying weakly, her small hands scrabbling at the beam that trapped her legs, her strength nearly gone. Kenneth did not hesitate, did not pause to question what she was or where she came from. He jammed his hands under the beam, feeling the metal sear his palms even through the calluses, feeling skin split and blister. The pain was enormous, overwhelming, but he channeled it into strength. He braced his feet against a piece of wreckage and lifted. Every muscle in his body engaged simultaneously, his back and legs and arms all working in concert, his entire being focused on the single task of moving that beam. It did not budge. Kenneth adjusted his grip, ignoring the fresh waves of agony, ignoring the smell of his own flesh cooking. He planted his feet differently, changed the angle, and lifted again. This time he felt movement, felt the beam shift upward, perhaps an inch. The girl beneath tried to pull herself free, but she was too weak, too injured, too terrified. Kenneth's vision was starting to gray at the edges, his body screaming for oxygen his lungs could not provide in this hellish atmosphere. He lifted harder. The beam rose another inch, then 2, then 4. Kenneth's entire body was shaking with the effort, muscles standing out like cables under his skin, veins bulging at his temples. A sound was coming from his throat, a roar of pure effort and determination, the sound of a man who refused to fail because failure meant the death of a child. The beam reached a foot off the ground, just enough clearance. The girl slid free. Kenneth dropped the beam and grabbed her, pulling her small body against his chest with his ruined hands. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of fragile bones and soft flesh. Her body so small she fit entirely against his torso. He turned and ran, stumbling over debris, his vision nearly gone now, operating on pure instinct and will. Behind him, something in the ship's core detonated with a massive, hollow boom that sent a shock wave rolling across the crater. The blast picked Kenneth up and threw him forward like a leaf in a hurricane. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, but he managed to curl his body around the girl, taking the brunt of the damage on his shoulders and back. They rolled, tumbling down the crater slope in a cascade of loose earth and gravel and small stones. Kenneth kept his arms locked around the child, feeling her tiny hands clutching desperately at his jerkin, hearing her thin scream of terror. When they finally stopped at the bottom of the slope, Kenneth forced his battered body to stand and kept running, putting distance between them and the burning wreck. He did not stop until they were deep in the forest, far enough that the heat was only a memory on his scorched skin, far enough that he could breathe without feeling like his lungs were melting. Kenneth sank down against a tree trunk, his legs finally giving out, his whole body trembling with exhaustion and shock, and the after effects of adrenaline. The girl lay against him, her breathing rapid and shallow, her small form shaking violently. Kenneth looked down at her properly for the first time, his eyes adjusting to the relative darkness under the forest canopy. Her skin was definitely undeniably blue, a rich cobalt color that seemed to have depth to it, like looking into clear water. It was not makeup or disease or reflection, but her natural state, as normal for her as Kenneth's pale skin was for him. Her features were humanoid enough to be immediately recognizable as such, but with subtle differences that marked her as something other. Her eyes were larger than human eyes with slightly different proportions, and they reflected light like a cat's eyes would. Her fingers were long and delicate, each tipped with small translucent nails. She was wearing some kind of garment that looked like it had been grown rather than sewn, seamless and perfectly fitted to her body. The material had been damaged by the fire, sections of it melted or charred, but enough remained to show it had been elegant once, possibly even formal. Kenneth noticed strange markings on the intact sections, symbols that might have been writing or decoration or both. The girl was staring up at him with those enormous eyes, her expression cycling between terror and confusion and something that might have been hope. She said something in a language Kenneth had never heard, a melodic series of sounds that were almost musical, her voice high and breaking. When he did not respond, she tried again, speaking more urgently, her small hands gripping his torn jerkin. Kenneth wished desperately that he could understand her, could tell her she was safe now, could explain what was happening. But he had no words that would reach her, no common language to bridge the gap between their species. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He shifted his grip carefully, lifting her more securely, cradling her against his chest the way he had once carried his sister's daughter before the colony ship, before all of this. Then he stood on shaking legs and began the long walk back to his shelter. The storm had intensified during his rescue, rain hammering down with enough force to sting exposed skin, wind roaring through the trees like a living thing. Kenneth moved carefully, his balance compromised by exhaustion and injury. His awareness narrowed to simply putting one foot in front of the other. The girl had stopped crying, whether from exhaustion or shock or simple loss of voice, he could not tell. She lay quietly against him, her small face pressed into his chest, her body still trembling. By the time Kenneth reached his shelter, every part of his body was screaming in protest. His hands were badly burned, the skin blackened and split in places, blood mixing with other fluids. His back and shoulders were bruised and possibly cracked from the impact when the explosion had thrown him. His lungs felt raw from breathing superheated air and toxic smoke, but he had made it, and the girl was alive, and that had to be enough. Kenneth laid her down on his sleeping pallet, the only soft surface in the dugout, a collection of furs and dried grasses he had spent months assembling. She did not resist, too exhausted and traumatized to do anything but stare up at him with those luminous eyes. He built up the fire quickly, his hands clumsy with pain but still functional enough to work. The flames caught and grew, driving back the cold and darkness, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. He heated water in a battered metal pot salvaged from the colony ship, one of his most precious possessions. While it warmed, he examined the girl more carefully for injuries. She had burns on her arms and legs, minor ones, thankfully, just reddened skin rather than the deep tissue damage Kenneth had suffered. Her clothing was destroyed in places, exposing more of that distinctive blue skin. There were no obvious broken bones, no bleeding wounds, no signs of internal injury. She had been incredibly lucky, protected by the structure of the ship even as it burned around her. Kenneth used a scrap of cloth torn from his spare shirt to gently wash the soot and ash from her face. She flinched at first contact, her body tensing, but as he worked with careful, deliberate movements, making himself slow and non-threatening, she gradually relaxed. Her skin felt slightly cooler than human skin should be, but not unnaturally so, just different. He cleaned her arms and legs as well, removing the worst of the grime, revealing unbroken blue skin beneath. The girl watched him the entire time, her expression unreadable. Kenneth could see her processing, evaluating, trying to understand what was happening and whether this strange, pale creature was friend or foe. He kept his movements steady and predictable, never making sudden gestures, always showing her what he was about to do before doing it. When he offered her water in a wooden cup he had carved himself, she hesitated for several heartbeats, her eyes flicking between the cup and his face. Then, driven by desperate thirst, she accepted it with both small hands and drank deeply, water spilling down her chin. Kenneth sat back, finally allowing himself to assess his own injuries. His palms were a mess, the skin destroyed by heat and pressure. These wounds would take weeks to heal properly, and infection was a real risk. He had learned crude field medicine through necessity, but without proper supplies, all he could do was clean the wounds and bind them loosely. He wrapped his hands in strips of clean cloth, working awkwardly with fingers that did not want to bend properly, pain making his jaw clench and his vision blur. The girl made a small sound, drawing his attention. She was watching him wrap his hands, something like understanding dawning in her alien eyes. She pointed to his hands, then touched her own chest, then pointed at him again. Kenneth thought he understood. She was connecting his injuries to her rescue, realizing that he had hurt himself pulling her from the fire. Kenneth nodded, then mimed pulling something heavy upward. The girl's eyes widened further. She said something in her language, a long string of musical syllables, her tone earnest. Kenneth had no idea what the words meant, but the emotion behind them was clear. Gratitude, wonder, questions. He wished desperately that he could answer those questions, could explain in words what had happened and what would happen next. But words were useless across the barrier of language, so instead he simply smiled, trying to make the expression gentle and reassuring. The girl stared at him for another long moment, then slowly she smiled back. It was a tiny, tentative thing, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was there. Kenneth pulled one of his spare furs from his meager collection and draped it over her, tucking it around her small form. She was shivering despite the fire, whether from shock or cold or both. He added more wood to the flames, building the heat until the dugout felt almost uncomfortably warm. The girl's shivering gradually subsided, her breathing deepening, her eyelids beginning to droop. Within minutes, she had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her small face finally peaceful. Kenneth sat with his back against the stone wall, watching her sleep as the storm raged outside. His mind was churning with questions he could not answer. What was she? Where had she come from? Were there others who had survived the crash? Would someone come looking for her? What had he just committed himself to by pulling her from that fire? But beneath all those questions was a simpler truth. She had been dying, and he had saved her. Nothing else mattered in that moment. Whatever consequences came from this decision, he would face them. He had spent 7 years learning to survive alone. Now it seemed he would learn something new, how to survive together. The first light of dawn crept through the thorny vines covering the entrance to his shelter, gray and hesitant. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and dripping. Kenneth had not slept, his body too full of pain and adrenaline, his mind too occupied with the impossibility of the small blue-skinned child sleeping on his pallet. He had kept the fire burning high, feeding it constantly, watching her breathe, alert for any sign of injury he might have missed or complications setting in. She stirred as daylight grew stronger, her eyes opening slowly, momentarily confused about where she was. Then memory returned and her body tensed, her gaze darting around the small space before fixing on Kenneth. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Kenneth kept his posture relaxed and non-threatening, his hands visible, his expression neutral. The girl studied him with an intensity that seemed beyond her apparent age, her alien eyes cataloging every detail. Finally, she sat up, pulling the fur around her shoulders like a cape. She said something, her tone questioning. Kenneth spread his hands in a gesture he hoped conveyed incomprehension. She tried again, using different words, then pointed at herself and said something that might have been her name. Kenneth tried to repeat it back, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. She frowned, then said it more slowly. After several attempts, Kenneth settled on a pronunciation that made her nod with what might have been approval, though he doubted he was getting it exactly right. In his mind, he simplified it to Judith, a name from his past that seemed close enough. He pointed to her and said it. She tilted her head, considering, then nodded again. Then she pointed at him, her expression expectant. Kenneth placed his hand on his chest and said his name clearly. She repeated it almost perfectly on the first try, her alien vocal cords apparently more flexible than his. It was a start. Over the next few days, they developed a fragile routine born of necessity and mutual dependence. Kenneth shared his food with Judith, carefully watching to see how her system reacted to human food, or rather, the alien equivalent that had sustained him for 7 years. He offered her roasted meat from the blue-furred predator he had killed, cutting it into small pieces. She ate tentatively at first, her nose wrinkling at the unfamiliar smell, but hunger overrode hesitation. She kept the food down, which Kenneth took as a positive sign. He showed her the berries he had learned were safe, taking her to the bushes and demonstrating which ones to pick. She learned quickly, her small hands darting among the branches to pluck the ripe fruits. He noticed she seemed to prefer the berries to meat, eating them with obvious pleasure, but she did not refuse the protein when he offered it. Water from his spring she drank readily, seeming to find nothing strange about it. Kenneth taught her how to recognize danger signs, how to read the forest the way he had learned to read it. He showed her the tracks of various predators, making exaggerated, fearful expressions and backing away to convey the message. She nodded solemnly, her eyes serious, understanding that this was not a game, but lessons in survival. He demonstrated how to move quietly, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. She imitated him, her smaller size actually making it easier for her to slip through the undergrowth silently. He discovered that her blue skin, which he had worried would make her conspicuous, actually helped her blend surprisingly well with the environment. The vegetation on this world had a distinct bluish tint to it, something about the star's spectral output and the plant's photosynthetic chemicals. Among the blue-tinged leaves and moss, Judith could crouch and become nearly invisible. Kenneth used this, teaching her to hide, to remain still when danger approached, to trust in camouflage and patience rather than flight. Communication remained difficult but slowly improved. Kenneth would point to objects and name them, speaking clearly. Judith would repeat the words, her pronunciation improving with each attempt. Water, fire, food, tree, sky, danger, safe. Her vocabulary grew daily, though conversation remained limited to simple exchanges. But they found ways to understand each other beyond words, through gestures and expressions, through the universal language of care and concern. Kenneth noticed changes in Judith as the days passed. Her initial terror faded, replaced by a cautious wariness that gradually softened into something resembling trust. She began to anticipate his routines, moving to help without being asked. When he gathered wood for the fire, she would collect kindling. When he prepared food, she would fetch water. She watched everything he did with intense focus, absorbing information like a sponge absorbs water. He taught her how to start a fire using his flint and steel, showing her repeatedly how to strike sparks into a nest of dry tinder. Her small hands struggled with the technique at first, unable to generate enough force, but she persisted with a determination that reminded Kenneth of soldiers he had trained long ago, people who refused to quit no matter how many times they failed. On the fourth day, she managed to coax a spark into flame. The expression of pure joy on her face made something crack in Kenneth's chest, a wall he had not realized he had built around his heart. The nights were when Judith struggled most. She would wake sometimes, gasping and crying, clearly reliving the crash in her dreams. Kenneth would build up the fire and sit near her, not touching because he did not know if that would comfort or frighten her, just being present. Eventually, she began to reach for him in those moments, her small hand finding his arm or leg, holding on like he was an anchor in a storm of nightmares. Kenneth would let her hold on as long as she needed, sometimes until dawn, his own sleep sacrificed so that she could rest. 2 weeks after the crash, Kenneth began teaching Judith more advanced survival skills. He showed her how to make simple snares from cordage. He twisted from plant fibers. His burned hands healed enough now to work with some dexterity, though the scarring would be permanent. The knots were complex, requiring a level of finger coordination that challenged her, but she worked at them with single-minded focus. They set snares together along game trails, and Judith checked them each morning with barely contained excitement. The first time they found a rabbit-like creature caught in one of her snares, Judith's face lit up with pride. Then she looked at the struggling animal, and her expression changed, became conflicted. Kenneth understood. There was a difference between eating meat someone else prepared and being responsible for the death that provided it. He knelt beside her and showed her quickly, efficiently, how to end the creature's life with minimal suffering. How to respect the animal even as you took from it. Judith watched with solemn eyes, then nodded slowly. She understood necessity, even at her young age. Kenneth fashioned a small knife for her from a shard of metal he had been saving, something he had cut from the colony's ship's hull years ago. The blade was only 4 inches long, but he shaped it carefully, gave it a proper edge, wrapped the handle in leather strips. He showed her how to maintain it, using his whetstone to keep the blade sharp, demonstrating the angle and pressure needed. Then he taught her how to hold it properly, how to cut safely, how to use it for both utility and, if absolutely necessary, defense. He hated teaching violence to a child, hated the necessity of it, but this world did not care about his preferences. Judith needed to be able to protect herself if something happened to him. So he showed her the vulnerable points on an attacker, how to target eyes and throat and joints, how to use her size as an advantage, staying low and mobile, attacking and escaping rather than standing and fighting. She practiced the movements with a seriousness that was heartbreaking. This small blue-skinned child learning to become a warrior because survival demanded it. Kenneth noticed that Judith was changing in ways beyond simple skill acquisition. She was becoming stronger physically, the regular activity and adequate food building muscle on her small frame. But more than that, her confidence was growing. She no longer flinched at sudden sounds but assessed them, determining threat levels the way Kenneth did. Her movements became more purposeful, more efficient. She was adapting to this world with a speed that surprised him, transforming from traumatized crash survivor to functional wilderness dweller in a matter of weeks. But Kenneth also saw that the crash had changed her in ways that went deeper than physical adaptation. She was quieter than he thought a 6-year-old should be, more serious, more aware of mortality and danger. She had learned too young that the universe was not safe, that disaster could strike without warning, that death was always close. It made him ache for her, for the innocence she had lost in that fire. 3 weeks after the crash, Kenneth found the first sign that they were not alone. He was checking his trap line in an area about a mile from his shelter when he noticed something wrong. A section of forest that should have been thick with undergrowth had been disturbed, plants trampled in a pattern that was too regular to be natural. Kenneth crouched and studied the ground carefully, his senses suddenly alert. There were no tracks, which was itself suspicious. Every creature that moved through this forest left traces. The absence of tracks meant something was deliberately erasing its passage. He found the first piece of evidence near a stream, half buried in mud. It was metal, about the size of his palm, made from the same strange, shifting alloy as Judith's crashed ship. The surface was smooth and seamless, with symbols glowing faintly across it in patterns that hurt his eyes if he looked too long. Kenneth did not touch it, instinct warning him against direct contact. He studied it from several angles, trying to understand its purpose. Some kind of device, clearly technology far beyond anything humanity had developed. But what did it do? After several minutes of observation, Kenneth carefully covered it with stones, marking the location in his mind. Then he widened his search pattern, moving in careful spirals, looking for other signs. He found them, fragments of that same metallic alloy scattered across a 100-yard radius. Someone had been here, searching, using technology he did not understand, and they were looking for something, or someone. They were looking for Judith. Kenneth's blood ran cold as the implications settled over him like a shroud. Of course someone would search for her. The ship that crashed had not been empty when it fell, had not been piloted by a child alone. There would be others of her kind, people who knew she had been aboard, people who would want to find her or recover her body. And now they were here on this world, sweeping the area systematically. He needed to move, needed to get Judith somewhere safer, somewhere harder to find. But he also needed to understand what he was facing. Kenneth spent the rest of that day scouting, mapping the search pattern he could see in the subtle disturbances. The searchers were working their way outward from the crash site in a grid pattern, methodical and patient. Eventually they would reach his shelter. It might take them weeks or months, but they would get there. Kenneth returned to the dugout as sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and orange. Judith was waiting for him, practicing with her knife the way he had taught her, her movements becoming more fluid each day. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that dimmed as she saw his expression. She said his name as a question, her tone concerned. Kenneth knelt beside her and tried to explain using their limited shared vocabulary and extensive gestures. People searching, people looking, danger coming. They needed to be careful, needed to stay hidden, needed to be ready to move. Judith processed this information with that eerie maturity she had developed, her expression becoming serious, her small hands gripping her knife tighter. She nodded understanding, no fear visible in her eyes, only determination. That night, Kenneth did not sleep at all. He sat at the entrance to his shelter, his sword across his knees, listening to the forest sounds and wondering how long they had before the searchers found them. His mind churned through scenarios and plans, weighing options, calculating risks. He could try to take Judith to the mountains, where the terrain was more difficult and easier to defend. He could attempt to make contact with the searchers, try to communicate that she was safe. He could prepare to fight, though he had no illusions about his chances against advanced technology. In the end, he decided on a middle path. They would not run yet, but they would prepare to run. They would not hide completely, but they would be more cautious, and Kenneth would do everything in his power to make sure that if the searchers came, they would have to prove themselves worthy of Judith's trust before he would let them take her. Because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, without fully realizing it was happening, Kenneth had started thinking of Judith as his responsibility. More than that, as family. The days that followed were tense with anticipation and careful preparation. Kenneth altered their routines, making them less predictable, varying the times they went foraging and the paths they used. He taught Judith how to hide her tracks, dragging branches behind her to obscure footprints, stepping on stones and hard ground rather than soft earth. He showed her how to use water to mask her scent, wading through streams, teaching her to hold her breath and submerge completely if necessary. They practiced hiding, finding caves and crevices where she could wait, in silence for hours if needed. Kenneth would leave her hidden and then return, testing whether he could find her. She got better at it quickly, her natural camouflage and growing understanding of concealment making her nearly invisible when she chose to be. Kenneth was both proud and sad, proud of her developing skills, sad that a child needed to learn such things. He also began preparing defensive measures around their shelter, subtle traps and warning systems that would alert him if someone approached. He strung cordage between trees at ankle height, attached to collections of hollow bones that would rattle if disturbed. He dug shallow pits covered with branches, not deep enough to seriously injure, but enough to make someone stumble and create noise. He positioned loose rocks on slopes where they could be triggered into small avalanches. Nothing that would kill, just systems to buy time and warning. Kenneth found more evidence of the searchers as the days passed. Another device, this one larger, apparently scanning the environment in some way, lights pulsing across its surface in complex patterns. More disturbed areas where something had passed through but left no clear tracks. Once he even heard sounds in the distance, mechanical whirring and clicking that was definitely not natural. The searchers were getting closer, methodically working their grid. He considered trying to destroy the devices but decided against it. Destroying them might alert the searchers that someone was interfering with their search, might make them escalate their efforts. Better to avoid them entirely, to remain undetected for as long as possible. So Kenneth carefully covered each device he found, marking its location, and moved on. Judith seemed to sense the growing tension. She became quieter, more watchful, always alert to Kenneth's signals. When he froze and held up a hand for silence, she would become as still as stone. When he pointed toward cover, she would move immediately and silently. They were developing a wordless communication born of necessity and shared danger, a language of gestures and expressions that conveyed meaning more efficiently than their limited common vocabulary could manage. One morning, nearly 4 weeks after the crash, Kenneth made a decision. They needed to move. The searchers were too close now, the frequency of evidence increasing daily. He spent that day packing their essential supplies into bundles that could be carried quickly, stripping the shelter of anything valuable or irreplaceable. His bow and arrows, his weapons, his fire-starting gear, dried meat and preserved berries, water bladders, rope, extra clothing. Everything else would be left behind. Judith helped without complaint, seeming to understand the necessity. When Kenneth showed her the bundle he had prepared for her, sized appropriately for her small frame, she nodded and tested its weight. It was heavy for her, but manageable. They would head north, deeper into the forest, toward rougher terrain where pursuit would be more difficult. Kenneth knew an area with better defensive positions, places where one person could hold off many if it came to fighting. They left at dawn the next day, Kenneth taking one last look at the shelter that had been his home for 7 years. So much of his life was contained in this small space, so many memories of struggle and survival. But places were not important, he reminded himself. Living was important. And the small, blue-skinned girl who followed him trustingly into the forest was important. They traveled carefully, Kenneth choosing paths that would be difficult to track, using every trick he had learned about moving without leaving traces. They crossed streams, climbed rocky sections, doubled back on their trail multiple times. Judith kept pace without complaint, her small face set in determined lines, her breathing controlled. She had come so far from the terrified child he had pulled from the fire, had grown so much in such a short time. By midday, they were miles from the old shelter, deep in a part of the forest Kenneth had only visited a few times. The terrain here was rougher, the trees more gnarled, the undergrowth thicker. They found a stream and followed it upstream, the water cold enough to sting, until they reached a series of rocky outcrops that offered multiple defensible positions. Kenneth chose a spot that gave them good visibility in all directions, with escape routes in 3 different directions, and began setting up a temporary camp. Judith helped gather firewood and prepare the campsite, her movements efficient now, her understanding of what needed to be done growing daily. That night, they ate cold food rather than risk a fire that might be visible, and slept in shifts, Kenneth taking the majority of the watch. The forest around them was full of nocturnal sounds, but nothing approached their position. The next morning brought an unwelcome discovery. Kenneth was scouting their perimeter when he found fresh tracks, clear impressions in the soft earth near the stream. They were not animal tracks, or not made by any natural creature. The prints were too regular, too geometric, resembling a humanoid foot but with strange proportions. Someone had passed through this area during the night, close enough that Kenneth should have heard them. Yet he had detected nothing. His blood turned cold. The searchers were not just using technology now, they were actively patrolling, sweeping through the forest with enough skill to move silently. Kenneth studied the tracks carefully, counting at least 3 distinct sets of prints, possibly more overlapping. A patrol, then, working in coordination. He followed the trail carefully for 100 yards, staying hidden, until he could see where they had stopped and apparently conferred before splitting up to cover more ground. Kenneth returned to camp quickly but quietly, his mind racing through implications. The searchers were adapting their tactics, becoming more sophisticated. They were no longer relying solely on technology, but were using ground patrols, hunters who could track and move like he did. This changed everything. They could not simply hide and wait for the searchers to pass. They would need to actively avoid contact, to stay ahead of the patrols, possibly to relocate again soon. He explained the situation to Judith as best he could with their limited language, using dirt to draw simple maps, showing her the tracks, making it clear they were being hunted. She listened intently, her young face grave, then nodded understanding. She was afraid. He could see it in the slight trembling of her hands, the way her eyes kept darting to the forest shadows. But she was not panicking, was staying focused and functional. They spent that day preparing, gathering more supplies, scouting multiple escape routes, identifying defensible positions. Kenneth also set more traps, these ones more serious than simple warning systems. He rigged deadfalls using heavy logs, positioned spike pits along likely approach routes, created trip lines that would trigger small avalanches. If it came to fighting, he wanted every possible advantage. The confrontation came the next afternoon, sudden and unexpected despite all their preparations. Kenneth and Judith were gathering edible roots in a small clearing, both of them alert and watchful, when the forest simply produced 3 figures, stepping out of concealment so smoothly it seemed like they materialized from thin air. Kenneth's hand went to his sword even as he was stepping between Judith and the newcomers, his body moving on pure combat instinct. The 3 figures stopped, apparently as surprised as Kenneth was. They were humanoid but clearly not human, their proportions slightly off in ways that marked them as alien. They wore what looked like armor, though it seemed organic rather than mechanical, fitted to their bodies like second skin, colored in mottled patterns that helped them blend with the forest. Their faces were partially concealed by helmets, but Kenneth could see blue-tinted skin beneath, similar to Judith's but different in shade. Each figure carried a weapon, strange devices that hummed with barely contained energy. Not quite guns, but clearly dangerous. For a long heartbeat, nobody moved. Kenneth could feel Judith pressed against his back, could hear her rapid breathing. His mind was calculating angles, distances, chances. 3 opponents, all armed with superior weapons, all probably trained. His chances in direct combat were poor. Then one of the figures spoke, a rapid stream of clicking and musical syllables in the same language Judith used. The tone was commanding, probably in order to surrender. Kenneth did not understand the words, but he understood the intent. He tightened his grip on his sword hilt but did not draw. Not yet. The figures were not attacking immediately, which meant they wanted something other than immediate violence. That something was probably Judith. The alien who had spoken tried again, using different words, probably attempting to communicate. When Kenneth still did not respond, the alien gestured toward Judith, the meaning clear. Hand over the girl. Kenneth's response was to shift his stance, his body language making his refusal unmistakable. The three aliens exchanged what might have been glances, apparently conferring silently. Then Judith did something unexpected. She stepped out from behind Kenneth, speaking rapidly in her own language, her voice high but firm. The three aliens reacted immediately, their body language changing from aggressive to something else, something that looked almost like shock. One of them lowered its weapon entirely, taking a half step forward while saying something that sounded respectful, even reverent. Judith responded, gesturing toward Kenneth, speaking emphatically. Kenneth could not understand the words, but he caught his own name in her speech, heard the tone shift from explanation to insistence. Whatever she was telling them, it was about him, about what he had done. The aliens listened, their weapons gradually lowering as Judith continued speaking. Finally, the lead alien made a gesture that looked like it might be placating or apologetic. It spoke again, this time more slowly, its tone less commanding. Judith responded briefly, then turned to Kenneth. She touched his arm and said several English words she had learned. Safe, no hurt, Judith friends. Kenneth was not convinced. His every instinct screamed danger, told him these were threats that needed to be neutralized. But he also trusted Judith's judgment more than he might have expected to trust a 6-year-old's. She seemed to recognize these aliens, seemed to believe they were not immediate threats. Kenneth forced his hand to relax, forced his breathing to steady, though he did not step down from his protective stance. The lead alien spoke again, and this time made a deliberate show of holstering its weapon. The other two followed suit, their hands moving away from any threatening positions. Then slowly and with exaggerated care, the lead alien reached up and removed its helmet. The face beneath was striking, undeniably alien, but also strangely familiar. Blue skin, yes, darker than Judith's, more mature, but recognizably the same species. The features were angular and elegant, the eyes large and luminous, the expression controlled but showing hints of relief and concern. The alien looked at Judith for a long moment, something complex passing across those features, then spoke gently, almost tenderly. Judith responded, her voice becoming thick with emotion Kenneth had not expected. The young girl who had been so controlled, so mature beyond her years, suddenly sounded like the child she was. The lead alien knelt, bringing itself to Judith's eye level, and spoke again. Then, moving very slowly, it opened its arms in what was clearly an invitation. Judith looked back at Kenneth, her expression torn. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the pull between the familiar figures in front of her and the human who had protected her. Kenneth knew what he needed to do, even though part of him wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her close and safe. He nodded slowly, giving permission he had no right to grant, but that she needed to see. Judith turned and walked into the alien's embrace. The alien wrapped its arms around her, holding her carefully, and Kenneth saw the tension drain from both of them. Judith said something muffled against the alien's chest, and the alien responded, one hand stroking her dark hair in a gesture that was purely parental, purely universal. Kenneth felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of relief and loss. These were her people, clearly. They had been searching for her, worried about her, and now they had found her, and she would leave him, and he would be alone again. It was right. It was proper. It was how things should be. But it hurt more than Kenneth wanted to acknowledge. The alien holding Judith looked up at Kenneth over the child's head, and their eyes met. Kenneth saw recognition there, saw understanding, and something that might have been respect. The alien said something, its tone formal, then placed a hand over its chest in what might have been a gesture of gratitude or respect. Judith pulled back slightly and spoke to the alien, gesturing toward Kenneth emphatically. The alien listened, its expression becoming more intense, more focused. Then it stood, still holding Judith's hand, and approached Kenneth with careful, deliberate steps. Kenneth tensed but did not retreat, his hand near his sword but not touching it. The alien stopped a respectful distance away and spoke, a long string of melodic syllables that Kenneth could not parse. Then it did something surprising. It knelt, going down on one knee, its head bowed. The other two aliens immediately followed suit, kneeling in unison. Kenneth stared, completely lost. What was happening? Why were they kneeling? Judith tugged on the lead alien's hand, speaking quickly, then turned to Kenneth and tried to explain using their limited, shared vocabulary. Kenneth saved Judith. Kenneth good. Kenneth. She struggled for words she did not have in English, then mimed pulling something heavy, mimed fire, mimed protecting. Understanding dawned slowly. They were showing respect. These aliens, whoever they were honoring him for saving Judith. Kenneth felt profoundly uncomfortable with the gesture, did not want their gratitude or their respect. He had done what anyone should do, had helped a child because she needed help. But clearly, from their perspective, this was significant enough to warrant this formal acknowledgement. The lead alien rose and spoke again, this time slower, clearly trying to communicate something important despite the language barrier. It pointed to itself and said what might have been a name or title. It gestured to the other two aliens, apparently introducing them. Then it pointed at Judith and said something that made the child nod vigorously. Finally, it gestured in a direction, the motion clearly indicating they should go that way. Kenneth understood. They wanted to take Judith somewhere, presumably back to their people, back to safety and civilization. And they wanted him to come along, at least for now. Whether as prisoner or guest, he could not yet tell. Judith looked up at him, her alien eyes pleading. "Kenneth, come?" she asked in English. "Please, Kenneth, come." He could not refuse her. Kenneth nodded slowly, then made a gesture indicating he needed to gather his supplies. The aliens waited patiently while he collected his weapons and pack, making no move to disarm him or restrict his movements. That was either a sign of trust or extreme confidence in their ability to handle him if he became a threat. Probably both. They began walking, the lead alien in front with Judith, Kenneth slightly behind and to the side, the other two aliens bringing up the rear. It was not quite a guard formation, but not quite a friendly hiking party either. Kenneth remained alert, his senses tracking every movement, every sound. But nothing in the aliens' behavior suggested immediate threat. They moved carefully through the forest, clearly skilled at wilderness navigation, occasionally pausing to let Judith rest or to offer her water from containers they carried. As they traveled, Kenneth observed them closely, gathering information. The aliens were clearly soldiers or guards of some kind, disciplined and professional in their movements. Their armor was sophisticated despite appearing organic, probably offering protection against multiple types of threats. Their weapons, now holstered, were compact but looked deadly. These were not simple scouts. These were elite troops, the kind of people you sent to recover something valuable. Someone valuable. It took Kenneth several hours of walking and observation before the full implication crystallized in his mind. The way the aliens treated Judith, with such careful respect and obvious relief. The formal kneeling gesture after learning he had saved her. The quality of the troops sent to find her. Judith was not just some alien child. She was important, significantly so. Possibly royalty or the equivalent, which meant Kenneth had inadvertently saved someone of enormous political value, which meant the consequences of his actions might be far larger than he had imagined, which meant he was walking into a situation he absolutely did not understand and had no way to control. They reached what appeared to be a temporary base camp before nightfall. It was set in a clearing that had been created recently, trees cut and vegetation cleared. Several more aliens were present, perhaps a dozen in total, all armed and armored. There were structures that might have been tents or shelters, though they looked more grown than built. Technology was visible everywhere. Devices that hummed and glowed, creating a perimeter that Kenneth suspected would be very difficult to penetrate undetected. The arrival of the patrol with Judith caused immediate reaction. Aliens emerged from the structures, their body language conveying excitement and relief. Several of them spoke rapidly to the lead alien from the patrol, who responded with what sounded like a report. Kenneth noticed that all of them, without exception, showed deference to Judith, treating her with obvious respect despite her young age. Judith was taken to one of the structures, the aliens clearly wanting to examine her and ensure she was healthy. She resisted initially, refusing to leave Kenneth's side, her small hand gripping his with surprising strength. The lead alien from the patrol spoke to her gently but firmly, apparently trying to reassure her. Finally, Judith looked up at Kenneth and said, "Kenneth, stay? Not leave Judith?" Kenneth knelt so he was at her eye level and placed his scarred hand gently on her shoulder. "I stay," he said clearly. "I promise." She searched his face for several seconds, then nodded and released his hand. The aliens led her into the structure, and Kenneth was escorted to a different one, this one less equipped but comfortable enough. The two aliens who had been part of the original patrol remained with him, not quite guards, but clearly watchers. Kenneth sat on what passed for a bench and waited, his mind churning through the impossible situation he found himself in. An hour later, the lead alien from the patrol returned and gestured for Kenneth to follow. He was taken to a larger structure where Judith was sitting on a raised platform, looking clean and refreshed, wearing new clothing that fit properly. She smiled when she saw him, her relief obvious. The lead alien spoke, and Judith translated haltingly, her English still limited but improving. "Judith, okay. Healthy. Thank Kenneth." She paused, struggling with more complex ideas. She gestured at the assembled aliens. They asked Judith about Crash, about Kenneth. Judith tell them, Kenneth brave. Kenneth save Judith from fire. Kenneth teach Judith. Protect Judith. Her expression became very serious. They understand Kenneth as hero. Kenneth felt profoundly uncomfortable with that designation, but said nothing. The lead alien spoke again. Longer this time, with Judith translating in fragments. The basic message was clear enough. They were grateful. They recognized his actions. They wanted him to accompany them when they left this world, to meet their leader, to be properly thanked. It was not quite a request and not quite an order. Something in between. Kenneth considered refusing, considered simply walking away and returning to his solitary existence. But one look at Judith's face, at the hope and trust there, made that impossible. She needed him still, or at least wanted him present, and he had promised not to leave her. So he nodded acceptance, though every instinct told him he was stepping into something far beyond his understanding or control. That night, Kenneth was given food and a place to sleep, treated more like an honored guest than a prisoner. But he noticed the guards, noticed the subtle ways his movements were monitored. He was trusted to a point, but only to a point. These aliens were professionals, and they were not careless. As he lay on an alien sleeping platform that was surprisingly comfortable, Kenneth stared up at the unfamiliar stars visible through a transparent section of the structure's roof and wondered what he had gotten himself into. A month ago, he had been a simple hunter, alone and content with his solitary life. Now he was apparently some kind of hero to an alien civilization, bound to a child who had crash-landed into his world and changed everything. Life, Kenneth reflected, had a twisted sense of humor. The next morning brought new developments. A larger spacecraft arrived, descending from the sky with technology that seemed almost magical in its smooth silence and precision. It was enormous, dwarfing anything Kenneth had seen, even the colony ship that had brought him to this world. The vessel settled into a cleared area with barely a whisper, its hull that same strange, shifting alloy, colors rippling across the surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. A ramp extended from the ship's belly, and more aliens descended, these ones clearly different in rank and importance. Their armor was more elaborate, their bearing more commanding. At their head walked an alien who radiated authority like a physical force, tall and powerfully built, skin darker blue than the others, wearing robes that somehow conveyed more danger than the armor of the soldiers. Judith saw this alien, and her face transformed with joy. She ran toward him, and Kenneth moved to follow, to protect her, but the guards gently restrained him. He watched as Judith reached the tall alien and was swept up into an embrace that was achingly human in its emotion and relief. The alien held her, spoke to her, his voice carrying clearly even at this distance, thick with feeling that needed no translation. Kenneth understood then. This was her father, or the equivalent in her species. This was who had been searching for her, who had sent soldiers and ships and technology to find her. This was why she was so important. After several minutes, the tall alien set Judith down gently, his large hands holding her small shoulders as he looked her over, apparently checking for injuries. Judith spoke rapidly, gesturing, clearly telling him everything that had happened. And repeatedly, Kenneth noticed, she pointed back toward where he stood under guard. The tall alien's gaze followed her pointing hand, and Kenneth found himself being studied by eyes that missed nothing, that assessed and calculated and judged with the precision of a trained warrior. The alien spoke to Judith, who nodded emphatically, then spoke again at length. Finally, the tall alien straightened and began walking toward Kenneth with measured, deliberate steps. Kenneth forced himself to remain calm, to meet that alien gaze steadily, to show neither fear nor aggression. The guards stepped aside as the tall alien approached, their deference absolute. The alien stopped an arm's length away, and they regarded each other in silence, human and alien, locked in a moment of mutual evaluation. Then the alien did something unexpected. He knelt, going down on both knees this time, his head bowed in a gesture of profound respect. And every single alien in the camp followed suit. Dozens of warriors and technicians and crew, all kneeling in unison. Kenneth stared, shock rendering him momentarily speechless. This was not just respect. This was something deeper, something ceremonial and binding. The tall alien spoke, his voice formal and caring, speaking in his own language but somehow conveying meaning beyond words. He was acknowledging a debt, Kenneth realized. He was making a public declaration that Kenneth had done something worthy of the highest honor his people could give. Judith ran to Kenneth's side and grabbed his hand, her voice excited as she tried to translate. Father says Kenneth is hero of our people. Says Kenneth showed true strength, true courage. Says, she struggled with complex concepts. Says Kenneth is friend to Empire forever. Says we owe Kenneth everything. The tall alien rose and approached again, this time extending his hand in what was clearly meant to mirror a human handshake. Kenneth took it, feeling strength in that grip, feeling the calluses that marked a warrior despite the fine robes. The alien spoke again, and Judith translated. Father wants Kenneth to come to our home, wants to thank Kenneth properly, wants Kenneth to be honored by all our people. She paused, then added in a smaller voice, Judith wants Kenneth to come too. Please? Kenneth looked down at the small blue-skinned girl, who had somehow become so important to him in such a short time. He thought about his shelter, abandoned now, his simple life of survival and solitude. He thought about the risks of leaving this world, of stepping into an alien civilization he did not understand. He thought about all the reasons he should refuse, should return to what he knew. Then he looked at Judith's hopeful face and realized the choice had already been made, probably weeks ago, when he had pulled her from the fire. I will come, Kenneth said. The preparation for departure took the rest of that day. Kenneth was brought equipment and clothing that fit him surprisingly well, apparently designed by the aliens, based on their observations of him. His weapons and personal gear were carefully packed and loaded onto the ship, nothing confiscated or taken from him. He was treated with consistent respect, every alien he encountered showing deference that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Judith stayed by his side through all of it, clearly not willing to be separated again. She showed him around the ship, her excitement bubbling over as she pointed out various features and tried to explain what they did. Most of it was beyond Kenneth's comprehension, technology so advanced it might as well be magic. But he appreciated her enthusiasm, appreciated the glimpse of the child she should be allowed to be, rather than the survival-hardened person she had been forced to become. As they prepared to board the ship for departure, Kenneth took one last look at the world that had been his home for 7 years. The forest stretched in all directions, beautiful and brutal, indifferent to the drama that had played out beneath its canopy. He had survived here, had learned and grown and become something new. Part of him would always belong to this wilderness, would carry the lessons learned in blood and hardship. But another part of him recognized that this chapter was closing, that his life was moving in a direction he could never have anticipated. He had thought his story ended when the colony ship crashed, thought he would die alone on this world eventually. Another forgotten casualty of humanity's reach for the stars. He had been wrong. His story was just beginning. Kenneth followed Judith up the ramp and into the alien ship, leaving behind the only home he had known for 7 years and stepping into an unknown future. The ramp retracted, the ship powered up with a sound like singing crystal, and they lifted into the sky. As the world fell away beneath them, Kenneth watched through a viewport, seeing the forest become a sea of blue-green, seeing the mountains where he had buried his fellow colonists, seeing the crash site where Judith's ship had fallen. All of it growing smaller, more distant, until finally they broke through the atmosphere and the world itself became just another sphere hanging in the darkness. Kenneth had left Earth as part of a colony mission. He was leaving this world as something else entirely. A hero, they called him. But he was just a man who had made a choice when choices mattered, who had helped when help was needed, who had protected when protection was required. If that made him a hero, Kenneth thought, then perhaps heroes were simply people who refused to walk away when walking away would be easier. The journey to the alien homeworld took a week of travel through a space that seemed to fold and compress in ways Kenneth's physics training insisted was impossible. He spent most of that time with Judith, teaching her more English, learning more of her language, discussing everything and nothing. She told him about her home, about a vast empire that spanned hundreds of worlds, about a civilization ancient and powerful. She told him about her mother, who had died when Judith was very young, about her father who ruled with wisdom and strength. She told him that she was a princess, though the word did not translate perfectly, that she had been traveling to visit allies when the ship malfunctioned and crashed. She told him that her disappearance had caused a crisis, that various political factions had tried to exploit her father's grief, that finding her alive had resolved tensions that might have led to war. Kenneth listened and absorbed, trying to understand the scope of what his simple act of rescue had affected. He had not just saved a child, he had potentially prevented a political catastrophe that could have destabilized an interstellar empire. The weight of that realization was almost crushing. The ship's crew treated him with consistent respect bordering on reverence, which Kenneth found increasingly difficult to handle. He was not comfortable with admiration, preferred to simply be left alone to work and think, but the aliens seemed to view him as something special, someone who embodied ideals they held dear. The lead soldier from the patrol, who Kenneth learned was named Hector, spent hours talking with him through Judith's translation, asking questions about his survival techniques, his fighting skills, his philosophy of life. Kenneth tried to explain that he was just a man who had done what survival required, who had learned through necessity rather than any innate brilliance. But Hector seemed to hear something else in those words, seemed to find deeper meaning in Kenneth's pragmatic approach to existence. It was strange and uncomfortable, being misunderstood in a positive direction. When they finally arrived at the Imperial homeworld, Kenneth was unprepared for the sight. The planet was beautiful beyond anything he had imagined, covered in vast oceans of startling blue and continents of emerald green. Cities glittered across the surface like jewels scattered by a careless hand, and the orbital space was thick with ships of all sizes, from small personal craft to vessels that dwarfed the one they traveled in. They descended toward the largest city, a metropolis that spread across hundreds of square miles, buildings reaching kilometers into the sky, creating their own weather patterns and microclimates. The ship settled into a landing platform that was itself larger than many towns Kenneth had seen on Earth, and the ramp extended onto alien soil for the first time. Kenneth stepped out and was immediately overwhelmed by sensation. The air was different, thinner but sweeter, filled with scents he had no names for. The light from the star was subtly wrong, casting everything in shades that seemed both familiar and alien. The sounds of the city washed over him, a symphony of voices and machinery, and life in all its chaotic glory. Judith grabbed his hand, anchoring him, and he looked down to see her smiling up at him with such joy it hurt to see. She was home, truly home, and the happiness radiating from her was like a physical force. They were escorted through the city, crowds gathering to watch, word apparently spreading rapidly that the lost princess had been found. Kenneth could not understand the words being spoken, but the emotions were universal. Relief, joy, celebration. Children were lifted onto parents' shoulders for better views. Adults pressed forward just to glimpse Judith, and a sound like thunder rolled through the streets as the population expressed their happiness. And wherever Judith pointed toward Kenneth, wherever she indicated the human walking beside her, the crowds responded with that same gesture of respect, that same kneeling that he had first witnessed in the forest. It was overwhelming and humbling and profoundly uncomfortable. They reached the imperial palace as the local sun was setting, the massive structure lit from within and below, glowing like something from a dream. Kenneth was taken to chambers that were larger than his entire former shelter, given clothing and food and everything he might need. But he could not rest, could not settle, the strangeness of it all keeping his nerves wound tight. The next morning he was summoned to meet Judith's father formally in the throne room before the full court. Kenneth dressed in the clothing provided, simple but elegant, and followed Hector through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, each more grand than the last. They passed through guard stations and checkpoints, through chambers filled with aliens conducting business, through galleries lined with what might have been art or historical records. Finally, they reached a set of doors that must have been 50 feet tall, made from some material that looked like crystal, but rang like metal when touched. The doors swung open silently, and Kenneth stepped into a throne room that defied comprehension. The space was vast, open to the sky above, supported by columns carved from single pieces of luminous stone. Hundreds of beings filled the chamber, aliens of dozens of different species, all dressed formally, all turning to watch as Kenneth entered. At the far end, elevated on a dais that seemed to grow from the floor itself, sat Judith's father on a throne that managed to be both simple and overwhelming. Judith was already there, standing beside her father, wearing robes that marked her status clearly. When she saw Kenneth, her face lit up and she waved, breaking protocol in a way that made several courtiers gasp. Her father's hand on her shoulder was gentle but restraining, though Kenneth could see amusement in those alien eyes. Kenneth walked the length of the throne room, his boots echoing in the sudden silence, every eye tracking his movement. He was a simple hunter, a survivor, a man who had lived alone in wilderness for 7 years. He did not belong here, among this grandeur and ceremony and power. But Judith needed him here, wanted him here, and that was enough. He stopped at a respectful distance from the throne and met the emperor's gaze directly, refusing to show fear or uncertainty. The emperor studied him for a long moment, and Kenneth got the sense he was being measured against some internal standard, evaluated and judged. Then the emperor stood, descended from his throne, and approached Kenneth directly. The court gasped collectively, apparently shocked that their ruler would leave his seat for anyone. But the emperor paid them no attention, his focus entirely on Kenneth. He stopped arm's length away, and they regarded each other, two men from different worlds who shared a connection through the small girl who meant everything to both of them. The emperor spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, speaking in his own language first for the benefit of his court, then switching to heavily accented but comprehensible English. You are Kenneth, the man who saved my daughter's life when her own people failed to protect her. You asked for nothing in return, expected nothing, simply acted because it was the right thing to do. The emperor's eyes seemed to bore into Kenneth's soul. You taught her to survive in conditions that would have killed most trained adults. You protected her from my own forces when they would have taken her from you without understanding. You demonstrated the highest values that my empire claims to uphold, and you did so alone, with no support, using nothing but courage and skill and honor. The emperor's voice grew stronger, addressing the entire court now. This human showed us what true strength looks like, not the strength of technology or numbers or power, but the strength of character, of will, of the refusal to abandon those in need. Kenneth acted while we searched. Kenneth protected while we failed. Kenneth succeeded where an empire could not. The emperor turned back to Kenneth, and his voice became formal, ritualistic. Therefore, I declare before all assembled that Kenneth of Earth is a friend of the empire, a hero to our people, and under my personal protection. Any who harm him, harm me. Any who dishonor him, dishonor me. His name shall be recorded in our histories as an example of what all beings should strive to be." Then the emperor did something that apparently shocked the assembled court into absolute stillness. He knelt, both knees on the ground, his head bowed, in a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. And every being in that throne room, hundreds of them representing dozens of species and countless worlds, followed suit. Kenneth stood alone in a sea of kneeling figures, overwhelmed by the weight of honor being placed upon him. He had not wanted this, had never sought recognition or fame. He had simply pulled a child from a fire because she needed help and he could provide it. Everything else had followed from that single moment of instinctive compassion. But as Kenneth looked at Judith, at the tears streaming down her blue face, at the love and gratitude and pride shining in her alien eyes, he realized something profound. Actions had consequences that rippled far beyond immediate effects. A single choice to help rather than ignore, to risk rather than flee, to connect rather than remain isolated, could change the course of events in ways impossible to predict. He had saved one child, and in doing so, he had apparently saved much more. The emperor rose and the court followed. He gestured for Kenneth to approach, and when he did, the emperor embraced him, a gesture that transcended species and culture, the universal expression of gratitude and respect. Kenneth found himself returning the embrace, feeling the strength in that grip, the emotion behind the formal ceremony. "You gave me back my daughter," the emperor said quietly, for Kenneth's ears alone. "You gave me back hope when I believed all was lost. This is a debt that cannot truly be repaid, but I will spend the rest of my life trying. Welcome, Kenneth of Earth. Welcome to your new home." And Kenneth, standing in an alien throne room on a world he had never imagined visiting, surrounded by beings he could barely comprehend, holding the gratitude of an emperor and the love of a small blue-skinned girl who had become like a daughter to him, realized that he had finally found what he had lost 7 years ago when the colony ship crashed. He had found a family. He had found a purpose. He had found a home. Not through grand plans or clever strategies, but through the simple act of refusing to walk away when a child needed help. Sometimes, Kenneth thought, that was all it took to change everything, to simply be decent when decency mattered most.